So I've been kind of talking for years about uh, the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana that we used to have, and what I believe based on the evidence we could have in the future. But this presentation has been evolving over the years as more science comes in and as more projects come online. So I'm going to try to go through as quickly as I can the current state of the Delta and what projects are online, and especially talk a little bit about the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion, which is the most transformative project in 300 years and is now out for public review. Okay. Oops. So, you know, as Jennifer said, I work in the National Wildlife Federation. I'm part of a coalition of groups that includes the Environmental Defense Fund, obviously National Audubon, the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, the Pontchartrain Conservancy, and lots of other local partners like Orleans Audubon. The project that I just mentioned, the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion, is out for public review. The comments had been due for May 4th, but they've just extended the comment deadline to June 3rd. And I'll re-show this slide at the end. I don't think anybody on this call is unaware of the fact that Louisiana is losing its wetlands, highest rate of wetland loss in North America, most wetlands lost of any of the 50 states. It's a well-documented and horrifying statistic. The red on this map is land loss up to the year 2000. Obviously, that's continued since. And this is one of those things, you know, we always think about environmental crises as something that happens, that you read about, people tell you, oh, this is terrible, something horrible is happening. But, you know, we don't generally experience it personally. But in Louisiana, we get to experience this in real time. This is an aerial photo of part of Terrebonne Parish in 1971. There's a marsh, there's swamp, there are habitable ridges, old distributary channels of the river going down. 1971, Dr. Peter Yockey was already alive at that point. I wasn't, but he was. This is the same shot in 2010. So that's only 40 years later. And here's the comparison. This is water in 1971. This is water in 2010. There's a little community here called Ile de Jean Charles, a little community of mostly Native Americans who used to live in a nice little ridge in the middle of the marsh and now live in the middle of the water. And they have often been cited as the first climate refugees in the United States. And the truth is, they're refugees not because of climate, they're just refugees because of everything that we've done to this delta over the last 300 years. But the reason this can't be saved is because of climate. It's because of accelerating sea level rise. If sea level was going to stay where it is right now, we could find a way to save that community. But given the fact that we face 1, 2, 3 feet of sea level rise, we can't do that. So this is a map that may be familiar to lots of you. Unfortunately, I somehow compressed it a little bit east to west here, but this is in the 2017 Louisiana Coastal Master Plan, the land loss that they project over the next 50 years without action in what they call the low climate scenario. And just to fill you in, this is New Orleans here. This is the Manchac Swamp. This is Bayou Sauvage. This is the central wetlands. This is the Barritaria Basin, Terrebonne Basin, the Chenier Plain. That's the low scenario, the best case scenario. Here's the medium scenario. And you can see the red just gets redder and redder and redder. Much of Cameron and Vermilion parishes completely disappear. Most of Terrebonne Parish disappears, much of Jefferson, much of Plaquemine, St. Bernard, and even up into the river parishes around Lake Maurepas. And here we go. This is the high scenario, which by the time the 2017 master plan came out, a lot of people thought was the real scenario. And what we know is Cameron Parish is gone. Vermilion Parish is gone. Much of the area around the Atchafalaya Bay and all these areas is gone. Lower Terrebonne is gone, lower Lafourche, lower Jefferson, most of Plaquemine, St. Bernard, and all these river parishes. And that's just because sea level rise overwhelms everything. You notice there are a few little green spots. This is the Wax Lake outlet on the Atchafalaya River. This is the Atchafalaya Delta. Those are places that are still getting riverine inputs, still getting sediment and water from the Mississippi River. And there's some tiny little areas down here. The problem here is even though we have the mighty Mississippi, most of the water goes out here through Southwest Pass, giant plume of sediment that goes into the Gulf because we have constricted the channel. And this area sinks at 1 inch a year. So it's already subsiding very rapidly. And when you add sea level rise, it just goes under. Why does this matter? Well, I think all of us on this call know the Louisiana Delta, the Mississippi River Delta, the coast of Louisiana is incredibly important for migratory birds, among many others. The shot here, the radar shot, the NexRad radar shot, these little blue dots in these high intensity areas, these are birds, these are birds coming into the Delta on a spring day. This is a cold front approaching. So if this weather hits them, they need this to land and survive. Imagine what it would take for a bird that's already exhausted crossing the Gulf of Mexico to add 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles to its flight before it can land and refuel. We know what those birds are. There are Eastern North America's neotropical migrants. But those marshes are also important for a whole suite of birds that are not neotropical migrants. They're just the birds that live in those marshes. And if those marshes disappear, it's going to have huge effects on the populations of all these species. This is what much of coastal Louisiana looks like now, a rapidly subsiding, deteriorating, disappearing coast, crisscrossed in this case by pipeline, oil and gas pipeline canals. You can see the canals are lined with spoil banks. That's the dirt, the mud, the sediment that was dug out to lay the pipeline and then piled on the banks. But everything around it is deteriorating. Now marshes change, deltas change all the time. And in the natural process, there is a deterioration that goes on, which proceeds by natural processes and is highly productive. It produces a habitat for, in this case, white pelicans, but everything else that the white pelicans is eating. Oops. So I have a lot of pictures of lots of birds here just because this is a bird talk. We all know how many birds are supported in that deteriorating delta in Louisiana. So that's the bad news, but I actually think there's hope and that there's a lot of reason to think that we could support even more wildlife, even more birds, even more biodiversity. And that's because of something that is known as shifting baseline syndrome. Before I get to shifting baseline syndrome, though, I do want to sort of talk about the unspoken danger, which is that anything we do now is contingent for its success on whether or not we do something about carbon emissions into the atmosphere. If Antarctica begins to break up, if Greenland melts into the sea, if the West Antarctic ice shelf melts, then we're talking about not 1, 2, 3 feet of sea level rise. We're talking about 5, 10, 15, 30 feet of sea level rise. What that means for the Mississippi River Delta is that the Mississippi River can build a delta anywhere, and it has thousands of times as the ice has grown and shrunk. But some of the Mississippi River deltas are up in Illinois, they're in Missouri, they're in Arkansas. And if sea level rises 10, 15, 20 feet, the Mississippi River can build a new delta, but it isn't going to be here in Louisiana. It's going to be way, way, way up the main stem. So we have to bring emissions under control. These graphs show you what happens if we meet the Paris Agreement and what happens if we don't. So if we get on this red trajectory, coastal Louisiana is going to be gone. Simple. The new shoreline is going to be somewhere up by Baton Rouge and north of Lafayette, well inland. And that's just physics, folks. There's nothing we can do about it. But at the present time, we know that we face 1, 2, 3, 4 feet of sea level rise over the next century, and there are things that we can do about it. So this is a kind of a graph of shifting baseline syndrome. This is something noticed by fisheries biologists a while ago, which is that if you ask anyone, they'll always tell you, oh, when I was a kid, when my dad was a kid, when my grandfather was a kid, there were so many more fish. And what that does to us is it gets us thinking, oh, if we just go back 30 years or 40 years or 50 years or 60 years, we get back to how great it used to be. But that's actually a false picture. We have been wiping out wildlife for 400 or 500 years. And as a consequence, nobody alive, nobody you've ever spoken to, not your father, mother, grandparents, great uncle, great aunt, actually remember a time when wildlife was as abundant as it had been in the past. And so as each generation moves forward, we have a skewed view of what the potential is. So we're on this black line. But if we change the trajectory, we can get on this line. So if you go back to something before any of our parents or grandparents can remember, we get back to when Europeans first arrived in North America and in colonial Louisiana. And it was a very, very, very different place. I happen to be a historian. And so I'm very interested in what few descriptions exist about what Louisiana was like when Europeans first arrived. And just one example, when Europeans got here, there were bison in the marshes of the lower river. Now, if any of you have ever tried to walk in a marsh south of the city of New Orleans, it's hard to imagine a deer being able to make it through that marsh. It's hard to imagine a raccoon being able to make it through that marsh. Humans sink up to their thighs. But it used to be a situation where there were bison, where bison could graze in the marsh, because the Mississippi River was carrying this vast quantity of sediment and building sea level marshes everywhere, which were firm. They were hard bottomed, and there were bison, giant animals. There were lots of other animals. We think there are a lot of alligators today. Well, you should read the early accounts. There were stunning numbers of alligators. And there was everything else that was living here in the Delta. And you have all kinds of accounts. And these accounts were mostly written after gunners had started blasting everything in sight. This is one of the more horrifying examples that I've come across. You know, John James Audubon lived in the city of New Orleans for a couple of years, 1820, 1821. And in his diaries, he recounts, he lived in a little cottage in the French Quarter, and he recounts one day he heard that it was going to be a good day for golden plovers. So he hiked from the French Quarter along the Esplanade Ridge out to Bayou St. John, and he watched gunners, market hunters, shooting golden plovers. And his original diary entry was that he saw more than 60,000 shot, but when he published it, he cut it down to 48,000. 48,000 golden plovers shot inside the current confines of the city of New Orleans by a couple of dozen gunners on Bayou St. John in 1821. Now, in my entire life of birding as hard as I can, I have not seen 200 golden plovers in Southeast Louisiana, much less 48,000 shot out of flocks in one day. If you look at the current estimates of the world population, 48,000 represents anywhere from 2 to 20% of the total world population today. So just another example of what I mean by sliding baselines. If I go see 10 golden plovers in one day on Grand Isle, I am thrilled. But that's a pathetic fraction of what people used to see all the time. And it wasn't just the quantity, but it was the quality of what was here in the Delta. This is an incredible photograph of an alligator gar, but it just speaks for itself. So we're seeing just a hint of what used to be here in coastal Louisiana. On this left photo, this is the largest remaining bald cypress in the world, up above Baton Rouge. But it's a glimpse of what used to be there. But most of these swamps that produce these cypress trees are dead. They've got trees, but there's no reproduction because they're sinking. They're standing water all the time. You can't get seedlings of swamps. There's one big exception, and that's in the Atchafalaya Basin, where they still have swamps that have hard bottoms and produce commercial quantities of crawfish and catfish and all kinds of other things. And the difference between this swamp and this swamp and this swamp and this swamp is that a river flows through it. So a river is constantly bringing new sediment, new nutrients, new energy, new life to the river. And as a consequence, you can go out there and catch commercial quantities of crawfish. There's no difference between these swamps and these swamps and these swamps, except that a river runs through this one. There's no difference. So Louisiana is facing both this biological shifting baseline and this physical shifting baseline. We're losing our land, we're losing our wetlands, and as a consequence, the biological shift is intimately connected. So we all know why that we all know kind of the history of what's going on here. This is the delta of the Mississippi River. Baton Rouge is here, New Orleans is here, Homa's over here, Lafayette's over here. This is the current Bird's Foot Delta. The Mississippi River has built a series of deltas out onto the continental shelf since sea level reached its current stand about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, once the ice sheets had melted. Originally, the Gulf went all the way up into Illinois and Missouri, and then the Mississippi River filled in the whole thing and then began building a series of deltas. We know what we did to it. We often talk about the fact that the Corps of Engineers since 1928, since the Great Flood of 1927, built this levee system. And we oversimplify and say the Corps cut off the river from the Delta, but in fact, the first European settlers began building levees in the 1720s. This is New Orleans here. These are all land grants, plantation land grants by the 1720s. And every one of these land grantees was required to build a levee. That was a condition of the land grant from the King of France or later the King of Spain. So that by the time of the purchase, of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the river was lined with levees on both banks from head passes below Venice all the way up to Baton Rouge. So levees are not a 20th century phenomenon. They've been around for 300 years. Luckily for the Delta, the early deltas were pretty bad. I mean, the early levees were pretty bad. They didn't work very well because every landowner, you know, the system was as strong as whatever landowner happened to be there. So if you had a bankruptcy, if you had a negligent landowner, the river would break out. It would break out of the levee. It would cause crevasses along Bayou Lafourche, along the main stem of the Mississippi River. This is just a few of them. And those crevasses put freshwater sediment nutrients back into the system, into the Delta system, to keep it alive. The other thing that we did, not just levees, but there had been a whole vast distributary system. It wasn't just one channel or two channels or three channels, it was lots of channels. And because the farmers living along each of these channels didn't like the spring flood, they used, you know, timber and earth, and they closed off the distributary channels so that water was confined to the main stem. And for navigation purposes, to get bigger and bigger and bigger ships into the channel, we began modifying passes into the Gulf of Mexico till eventually we had Southwest Pass, which extends all the way to the edge of the continental shelf. So the vast quantity of water that comes down the Mississippi River, the vast quantity of suspended sediment, the clay and the silt, goes out through Southwest Pass into the Gulf of Mexico. We have another big problem, which is that we're a delta and we're sitting on older and older and older deltas. It's more than 30,000 feet down to the bedrock. So we're as far from the bedrock in New Orleans as you are on the top of Mount Everest, 30,000 feet. Between the top of Mount Everest and the bedrock is rock. Between us and the bedrock is clay and silt and sand and sandstones and siltstones, things that are easily compressed and pushed down. So we're subsiding all the time. And there are all kinds of different reasons that we subside. But the main reason is we have this giant delta, thousands of years of new material building up on a weak substrate that's pushing down. We're actually cracking the crust. And also way down at the bottom is an old sea. And so there's a big salt layer, which causes salt domes and all kinds of other interesting things. But it's also fluid. And so the entire delta front is just kind of sliding into the Gulf of Mexico. So we have one of the highest subsidence rates in the world. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is this. All of this is sinking, it's eroding, it's washing away, while all of this, the yellows in this photo, this is Barritarian spillway opened in 2011. This is the Atchafalaya River. This is the Wax Lake outlet. This is all the sediment of the Atchafalaya River. This is the Bird's Foot. All of this sediment that you see in yellow is going anywhere except where it's needed, which is here. We need it here, and it's not going there. What do we do about it? Well, the state of Louisiana, astonishingly, after the 2005 hurricanes, actually began an organized, science-based, constrained process of developing a master plan for how to spend whatever money comes along. And as a consequence, we now have the 2017 master plan, and we're working on the 2023 master plan, which lays out a series of prioritized projects that actually change the trajectory. We can't save everything. We cannot go back to what was in the past, but we can change the trajectory. It's based on real science. It's based on realistic looks at what's going to happen in the future, based on the best science and the best models, including subsidence and sea level rise. It's projects that have been put together. They're aspirational. You know, nobody's writing us a blank check. We have to find every penny that we need for this. But because of the BP oil spill, because of the gigantic settlement, we actually have money to begin implementing this master plan. And as you're going to see, about half of all of the money paid for restoration by BP and the other guilty parties is going to go to Louisiana, because that's where most of the damage was. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see, you know, that there's all kinds of different funds. There are all kinds of different ways it's available, all kinds of different rules for how you get to spend it. There's the criminal settlement. Just note the number, over $1 billion to Louisiana. There's the Clean Water Act civil settlement. Again, huge amount of money available to Louisiana. And then there's the natural resource damage settlement, which is to remediate the actual damages to natural resources and to people exploiting those natural resources, including birders. And that's a minimum of $5 billion, plus a piece of the ocean, open ocean, a piece of various other region-wide and unknown condition funds available to Louisiana. So I'm not going to go into this. This is the breakdown of funding that was agreed to in the settlement in federal court. So I think it's kind of important for those of us who are birders and who are interested to kind of see some of what's already been done, because most of it's out of sight. Louisiana is not like most coastal states. You can't drive to the coast. You can't. There are only a few places where you can see the Gulf of Mexico from a car in Louisiana, unlike Florida or Alabama or Mississippi or Texas or North Carolina. Anyway, it's hard to see what's going on out there, but a lot is going on. So some have seen this. This is one of the places you can drive, the rebuilding of Holly Beach. This is something you can see a bit of, which is when you get to Elmer's Island. The rebuilding of the Caminada Headland includes Elmer's Island, one of the biggest restoration projects in world history. Huge amount of sand moved from an offshore shoal to the shoreline, and having profound effects on the nesting success of least terns and Wilson's plovers, which used to wash out every year because we'd always get a little high water. But now, because we've got 3, 4, 5, 6 more feet of elevation and a much wider beach and ridge and dune system, birds are surviving. They got hit pretty hard last year, but it's all still there. You may have read recently the rebuilding of Queen Bess, which is one of the first restoration projects in Louisiana, but it had subsided, washed away, was sinking. There wasn't a lot of nesting habitat left. This is it after the completion of the project. So the green here is this over here. Huge number of pelicans and lots of other species nested. Many of you have probably seen what happened on Grand Isle this last winter. Storms had eaten away the west end. Again, this is not a wildlife project. It's to save these houses, but it has really important effects on wildlife. If anybody's been out there birding and seen the birds on this beach. And here's some that are not accessible by vehicle. The rebuilding of Schofield, not just the front beach, but the back barrier marsh. Shell Island East, only get there by boat. Again, beach, back barrier marsh. Chandler Island, the North Island, one of the more incredible bird places on the planet. At one point, right after Katrina, some geologists projected that Chandler Island would be gone in a few decades. Well, now it's got a new lease on life. Marsh creation projects like at Lake Hermitage, where big subsided area materials pumped in from the river. I put a picture of a black rail here. They don't really occur in that habitat, but they do occur in some of the habitats that are being recreated. The project that's about to get underway is Rabbit Island and Calcasieu Lake. Again, huge nesting rookery in Calcasieu Lake that had pretty much subsided to the point there was no habitat. On the Breton Islands, big restoration project that's literally underway, and the largest tern colonies in North America, outside of the Tortugas, are being restored. But the most difficult and expensive projects are ahead, and those are river diversions, and that's what I kind of want to talk about now. Again, to remind you, sediment going into Bonnet Carré into the lake, going out into the deep Gulf, not very useful places for it to go. Collapsing wetlands, no longer getting sediment. The reason this is so important is because we, in coastal Louisiana, we have so much abundance and so much biodiversity because of the delta cycle, because that river is constantly switching. It's changing course. It's creating new subdeltas, new subdistributaries. And basically we have a geological process, which is you build a delta lobe, the river abandons it, it begins to deteriorate, but the biological arc follows, it is delayed, and it actually peaks during the period of decay. And that's incredibly important. And so we have spent much of the last century in this period of decay, and we've been watching the biological productivity peak. And that has disguised the fact that we're about to do this. So this is another way of looking at it. Here's the delta cycle. A delta lobe builds, it peaks, it goes away. But as this one deteriorates, a new one is being built. And as this one deteriorates, a new one is being built. And as this one deteriorates, a new one is being built. But in the 20th century, we have steepened the curve. We've built levees, we've built canals, we've built roads, we've done all kinds of things to make land loss speed up. But because of levees, because of distributary closures, because of navigation changes, there's no land building going on. So this cycle has been interrupted. We have to get this cycle back. A lot of people argue that, well, we just need to really hurry this up and we got to go out and create marshes. And we are doing that. There are millions, billions of dollars being spent on marsh creation. But if you build an artificial marsh, it's got some biological value, it's got physical value, but the same processes that caused this in the first place are going to happen again. And so by the time you get out 20 or 30 years, your marsh project has disappeared unless you connect it to the delta cycle and put new water and sediment in every year the way a delta does. So we know how it works. The river confines itself in its own natural levees. It finds a weak spot, it breaks out, it begins building a new subdelta. This happens all the time. This is the Carnarvon subdelta. This is a freshwater diversion that the Corps conceived of in the early 1960s and finally completed in the 1990s in St. Bernard Parish. It was built into a big artificial impoundment that's about 6 or 8 feet deep called Big Mar. The Corps designed it to minimize sediment capture from the river because they didn't want to deal with sediment. They were just interested in fresh water. And yet a new delta lobe has built out into Big Mar. This was 6 to 8 feet deep, and now there's emergent land. And this was built for purposes to minimize, not maximize, minimize the amount of sediment coming out of the river. So here's Big Mar in 1998, big rectangular pond. This is 2013, almost completely filled in. And this is very shallow. It's continuing to fill in. This is another diversion at Davis Pond. They built this canal into this big open pond. You can see it's almost all filled in. Same principle. They really didn't want to capture any sediment in this project. It was a bunch of engineers. They were told move fresh water. So they designed something to minimize the amount of clay and suspended sediment that the river was carrying. And yet there is a magnificent subdelta in here. And it spreads beyond just the new land that's built. This is existing marsh. And you can see the soils are highly organic, just a little bit of sediment in them. And then once Davis Pond opens, thick clay layer, compressing the organic layer beneath. That's much more stable. Trees can grow. So the idea is to build artificial diversions from the Mississippi River so that we can keep the levees, we can keep people living where they live, we can keep the roads, the railroads, the pipelines, the communities, but we can build physical analogs of a natural crevasse from the river. So this is Wax Lake. Here's Morgan City. Here's the Atchafalaya River. The Atchafalaya River flows past Morgan City through this gap in the Tesh Ridge and then out into Atchafalaya Bay. The Corps noticed that the stage at Morgan City kept rising and rising and rising. So they had two choices. They could either keep raising the levees, or they could find a new outlet. So in 1941, before you had to do an environmental impact statement or get any public input or get anyone to agree with what you're doing, the Corps just cut an artificial canal through the Tesh Ridge right here, so that Atchafalaya River water, instead of having to go past Morgan City, some of it could bypass and go out into Atchafalaya Bay. 1973, there was a big flood on the river, and fishermen began to notice you had to be careful in this area because it was getting shallower and shallower. In 1983, they began to see some emergence, and then eventually the Wax Lake subdelta lobe was built. You can see it here. This is a time lapse, 1983, the first land begins to emerge. 1991, big subdelta lobe. 1999, a year that a bunch of tropical activity took place, a bunch of storms in 1999, 2000, 2001. So in 2001, you see it's been knocked back a little bit. But by 2004, it's grown back out again. And of course, you know what happens in 2005, Rita and Katrina. 2006, you can see the effects. There's actually loss. But by 2007, it's returning. 2015, and it obviously has continued to grow. So this is a man-made canal through the levee from the river and a totally unplanned subdelta out in a very deep, high energy environment in Atchafalaya Bay. So the idea of the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion is to do the same thing. This is New Orleans, Myrtle Grove. The point is to put a diversion here, like you see here, and build a new subdelta lobe. It's going to be controlled. There are going to be gates so they can open it, close it, control the amount of water that comes in. The intake here is minus 40 feet into the river. They've sited it in a sandbar so that it maximizes the capture of sand. And then it goes through this channel out into the Barritaria Basin. This is some modeling. This is modeling, incidentally, that assumes 1.5 meters or something like 5 feet of sea level rise over the next 50 years, which is a pretty aggressive sea level rise scenario. But nevertheless, it begins building land by year 10, 20, 40, 50. You notice that between year 40 and year 50, it actually starts losing land, and that's because of that aggressive rate of sea level rise. If sea level rise is not that bad, there's much more green. This is another model showing what happens even by year 6. The red is land that begins to emerge above sea level by year 4 and then year 6. So what does all that mean? So in the 2017 master plan, which proposes to spend about 25 billion years over the next 50 years on 25 billion in today's dollars. Over the next 50 years, we're going to see what this graphic is going to show us, what can be accomplished. This is where we are now. The black is land, the white is water. This is the future without action in year 50. This is future with the master plan in year 50. So you can see the, oops, you can see the difference. We still lose a tremendous amount of land. This is at a pretty modest sea level rise scenario. But we do hold on to critical parts of the coast with all of the projects in the master plan. Is it enough? No. The master plan only uses part of what's in the river. We need to start thinking about even more, even bolder action that starts to hold on to most of the sediment in the Mississippi River. We and our friends at EDF did a design competition a few years ago that looked at what you could actually do to sustain a future delta in the face of climate change. There were 3 groups chosen to present their ideas, and all of them came up with pretty much the same idea, which is to concentrate on a smaller, more sustainable delta. This is one of the one of the conceptualizations. Again, these faucets are just showing more ways to get water and sediment out of the river in more places so that you can sustain this land mass, but you're going to give up much of the coast when you do that. This is another one, another sense. You notice they build a gigantic diversion just below the city of New Orleans at Carnarvon. Here's another group of designers, again, smaller, more connections to the river. Recognize that you're going to give up a big part of the coast, inevitably. And one more, again, same thing. More connections to the river, more water and sediment coming out, new navigation channel, and a smaller coast. This is that idea of a big diversion just below the city of New Orleans. This will actually reduce the flood of the Mississippi River by like 10 feet because you reduce all the friction of holding water inside the system, so that the levees in Audubon Park and all these places would not be necessary for riverine flood control. Again, we're here. The question is, can we get on this? Can we, by using the river, by using the sediment, by using the energy that the river can put back into the system, it's actually physics. You put more in, you get more out. Can we get on one of these trajectories? Again, I encourage everyone to send in comments. There are a lot of action alerts out there. You can just sign on, but if you personalize a comment, if you change it by 10 or 15%, then it gets counted as an individual comment and carries more weight. So I encourage you to do it. Here are our web locations and so on for the campaign. And with that, Jen, I will open it for questions.